Good evening and welcome everybody to fifth edition of our summer lecture series called Throwback Thursdays. I'm Rob Schwenker. I'll be your host this evening, and we welcome you on what is also Dodgers opening day, which around my house is, as you can see, a very important day, a very important holiday. I've got my Dodger gear. I've got my Justin Turner authentic beard. I've got my game day beverage. Later there will be sausages on the grill. Very excited about that. And so I can assure you that by 7 o'clock, this program will indeed end. If you love our programming, if you're appreciative of what we're currently doing, if you're appreciative of local history, if you want to see us continue to be able to do this, please do consider a donation of any amount to the Santa Monica History Museum. We would greatly appreciate it. Tonight, we have the foremost expert on the Santa Monica Pier, and that's Deputy Pier Director Jim Harris. He is perhaps more commonly recognized as the Pier's historian and author of Santa Monica Pier, A Century on the Last Great Pleasure Pier, which was published by Angel City Press in 2009. He has spent nearly every day of the past 31 years on the pier, originally as a bartender at the Boathouse restaurant. His other written works include stage play, Save the Pier, and the children's book, Stella Rose and the Sea Dragon. Please welcome Jim Harris.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Santa Monica History Museum. It's always a pleasure working with you all. And as you mentioned, I began working on the pier I took a job as a bartender 31 years ago at the old Boathouse restaurant. So for those of you out there who remember the Boathouse, and if you visited there between 1989 and 1995, you probably crossed paths with me then. I was a skinny little bartender, and I'm really a skinny older adult now. So, for the past, let's see, 18 years now, I've been working for the Pier Corporation. Some of you may know that as the Pier Restoration Corporation, but we dropped the restoration part as the pier's been restored for many, many years now. So the pier has been an everyday part of my life for 31 years now. It is literally home to me. And as part of that, as part of what I have done, first listening to stories as a bartender and later interviewing people, I've collected a lot of wonderful stories and collected people's memories. And I've come to realize that really that's what the pier is, more so than a pile of sticks that you can walk out over the ocean on, or an amusement park above the ocean, or anything like that. I think really the heart and soul of the pier is people, and the memories that have been created by those before us and by those who are still creating memories today. This is a person that some of you may recognize. If you've been around Santa Monica for a long time, you certainly know the name, and his nickname, Shay J. And Jay was a wonderful local character. I think everybody had to know him, certainly back in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, all the way up until he passed away. I casually asked him one day if he had any pier stories, because he's been around for so long. And this was his reply to me: "I got pier stories? How much time do you have?" It turns out that Jay was just out of the Navy, and he visited the Santa Monica Pier, and he took a job at Sinbad's, which was about halfway down the pier where the trapeze school is today. And that was his first civilian job. Not long after that, he bought a little cafe up on Ocean Avenue and converted it into his own restaurant and playpen, Shay J's. And so someone whose roots are as a bartender on the pier, just like me. And Shay J, he and I had a lot of wonderful conversations about the pier. The pier actually opened 111 years ago on September 9th, 1909. If you write that numerically, it's 90909. So a lot of nines in there, very easy to remember. We like to celebrate it every year in some way. Last year we tried to establish it as the day that we would do the Save the Pier play, which is really a commemorative history of the pier. And this year we unfortunately won't be doing that again, but we will be next year. That doesn't mean we won't be doing something special on the pier this year for September 9th. It'll just be something virtual probably, and hopefully something that you can all enjoy. So keep your eyes and ears open for September 9th and what we're doing special on that day. One of the very special people that was associated with the Pier's opening day, and you can see this was a very exciting day for Santa Monica, was a man named George Freeth, whom many refer to as the godfather of United States surfing. He's the one that introduced surfing to a lot of people here. And he was a lifeguard in Venice, and he was around to judge races and beach competitions on opening day. Something very special about our pier that would draw people here, because you can see that there's no amusement park. There's nothing really to do except walk on this pier. It was the very first pier made entirely of concrete on the west coast of the United States, and actually the second one in all of the United States. So it was a marvel for its time, the new technology. And it's great that it had that distinction, because its other distinction was that it opened as a public utility. It was not built just for people to walk out upon or fish upon or look at that naval flotilla passing by. But it was actually built to run sewage out into the ocean. It was the answer to Santa Monica's accumulating problem of sewage and what to do with it. So once a week, they would run treated sewage out to the end of the pier and dump it into the ocean. And that is our Santa Monica Municipal Pier and what it opened as. What it became later, of course, is a much greater existence. But for the first 15, 16 years of the pier's existence, it was running sewage out into the ocean. Do we still do that today? Not at the Santa Monica Pier, of course, but of course through the Hyperion line, which is actually what Santa Monica joined to remove this from happening at the Santa Monica Pier. Kind of a yucky thought, if you will. But fishermen learned right away. In fact, on September 8th, 1909, some fishermen snuck out to the end of the pier on the day before it opened, and had such luck at the end of the pier that they declared the pier the best fishing spot in all of the Santa Monica Bay. And sure enough, they were pulling up, for years, they were pulling up these giant black sea bass off of the end of the pier. And that's a very large fish. That's not actually as large as they get a little larger than that. Those are two rather short men in that photograph. But they could grow to be about 6 feet long and weigh 600 to 800 pounds. And they could live to be 80 years old. They were slow growers. And as such, they were fished almost to extinction. They're protected fish today. There was actually one caught off of the end of the pier in 2005. It was a juvenile, about 3 feet long. And everybody had to have their picture taken with it before it was thrown back into the ocean. That man on the left, keep an eye on him. His name is Dick Hernage, the guy in the flat cap. He's had a very significant role in the pier, and we're going to see a picture of him again later. He ran fishing boat operations out at the end of the pier, along with several others, for many years, and he was a very vital part of the pier community, as was Frank Volk, the man on the right, who owned a bait shop out at the end of the pier. But a sewer pier is not what Santa Monica wanted to be known for, even though it was made of concrete and had that distinction. Right away, people wanted something more from Santa Monica's pier. There was a group of people that really pushed to have an amusement park added to it, similar to what was down in Ocean Park and then in Venice at the time. And there was a group of people that wanted a yacht harbor. And while there were two very distinctly different purposes, ultimately, the pier had each of those. The first being in 1916, when a man named Charles I.D. Loof entered the picture and leased land south of Municipal Pier. And upon that, he was to build an amusement park. Charles Loof was very famous for being the man who carved the first two carousels for Coney Island. He was a very respected and famous carousel carver who later became an amusement park entrepreneur and built amusement parks all over the country. One was the Pike in Long Beach. You can find his carousels still around the world, and they're among the most prized carousels in the world right now. He was that well respected. So he leased the land south of the Santa Monica Pier so that he could open the Loof Pleasure Pier. Now, his pier was made entirely of wood, and creosote treated wood, which was a technological marvel in itself right around the time that the concrete was becoming popular as well. And the idea that the treated boards would last longer and be more resilient to the elements than resistant to the elements than the untreated wood, of course. So he attached his wooden pier to the concrete pier. So if you really think about it, the Santa Monica Pier is two piers that are connected to one another. And you can experience that today, not only by looking at it and looking at the long pier, which is the municipal pier that's been there since 1909, and looking at the wider pier, which is the original Louvre Pleasure Pier. Some people call it the Newcomb Pier today, but you can also notice as you're walking on the pier that it's on two different levels. And so there's a very clear distinction, and there's even a curb that keeps people from tripping sometimes. You can show off to your friends that the pier is two different piers if you wish when you're walking down the pier, which is a fun thing to do. Not many people know that. They think it was just an unusually shaped pier when it was built. Now, I mentioned that Charles was a carousel carver, and of course, in 1916, he installed one of his own carousels within our building, and this is what that carousel looked like. You can see the jumping horses on the outside, which are markedly different from the carousel horses that you see here today, and I'll talk more about our current carousel a little bit later. But those are the very ornate and delicate and beautiful carousel horses that Charles Loof carved. He also surrounded the ride with rocking chairs. So there's no fence that those of you who are familiar with it today experience. Up over to the right, you can see the brass ring dispenser. So you could literally reach for the brass ring and get a free ride if you got the brass ring. So it was the top amusement here at the pier for many, many years. And still, the merry-go-round building is still the cornerstone of the Santa Monica Pier, that probably still not the most recognizable, but the most traditionally recognizable part of the pier. And the distinction, and I'm going to go back to the previous slide, the distinction of that building is so remarkable. In 1987, it became a national landmark. It was accepted into the National Registry of Historic Places, which is the highest distinction that a building can have. So when you're looking at this old mixture of Byzantine and California and Moorish architecture, first thing you see on the pier, you're looking at a national landmark. It's got as high a distinction as, say, the Statue of Liberty, which some people who are very attached to the pier claim it as their Statue of Liberty. Charles Loof passed away in 1918, and his son, Arthur Loof, was very busy with Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. In fact, if you've been up to Santa Cruz, there's one of Charles's carousels still there, and also Arthur's roller coaster. That wooden roller coaster was built by Arthur Loof. And while the Santa Monica Pier's business was left in Arthur's hands, he wasn't as attentive to it as he probably could have been. And in 1923, he sold the property, sold the lease to a group of realtors who renamed it the Santa Monica Pleasure Pier. And they really wanted it to be the people of Santa Monica's playground. And they expanded an amusement park that Charles Loof had built, and also expanded the property to make room for the largest ballroom in the world, the Lamonica Ballroom. And it was an amazing, fantastic, giant structure that was often referred to as looking like a castle floating over the ocean. To give you an idea of how large this is, the Lamonica Ballroom sat in the exact same footprint that Pacific Park Amusement Park does today, which you may think that the amusement park on Santa Monica is not very large, but when you look at it in perspective of the rest of the pier, it's a pretty large footprint. And that was where we had our Lamonica Ballroom. It was so popular that, as the quote from the Evening Outlook says below, on the day that it opened, 50,000 people came to see it. 30,000 passed through the doors, and over 5,000 people danced on the floor, the finest floor in America, Ask Anyone. Those numbers may be exaggerated. I can tell you from personal experience, because Our own Twilight concert series is drawn up to about 24,000 people, and anybody who knows that series knows what the pier and beach look like just with that many people. But one thing that I can tell you is that this opening night of the Lamonica Ballroom caused the first ever traffic jam in Santa Monica on record. And that's a wonderful distinction to have too, because we have traffic jams every day, right? I mentioned that there were two groups that had specific designs for the pier, the amusement park folks, and they had a successful amusement park on the pier for a number of years, really put to rest by the Great Depression now. By 1930, there were no rides left on the pier other than the merry-go-round inside Louv's Hippodrome building. The other group was, of course, as I mentioned before, the Yacht Harbor advocates. And it took them a long time and many tries, but in 1931, in the middle of the Great Depression, they were able to convince the city to put on the ballot, or to put on the ballot a measure proposing funding to build a breakwater off of the end of the pier and create Santa Monica Yacht Harbor. And this was sold on the premise that the Yacht Harbor would be built by Santa Monica workers, and that the moorings, of course, would create income for Santa Monica, and businesses on the pier would benefit as well. So it was really, the focus was all to benefit Santa Monica during very difficult times. And you can see the drawing here, that there's a bridge from the end of the pier that runs out to a lovely breakwater, a very fine looking great breakwater that's not the rock mound that we see today. It was actually to be built of concrete. And sure enough, the measure passed in 1931, and in 1933, they began building the breakwater. And they finished 2 cribs in San Pedro, a crib being a section of the breakwater, and they would set it out 300 feet off of the end of the pier, and then set the next one beside it and the next one beside it. And you would have a breakwater out, a concrete breakwater out at the end of the pier with this bridge to it that you could walk on. So they finished the first 2 cribs and they delivered the first crib. And 1 week later, they discovered a big crack in that crib, which was a disaster because clearly this concrete breakwater was not going to work. That the technology just wasn't quite where they needed for it to be. So they called in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for an assessment, and the Army Corps of Engineers advised them that you still have the money to build a rock mound breakwater, so scrap this idea of a concrete breakwater, scrap the bridge. You can still have your yacht harbor, just use a rock mound breakwater, like what you see in Long Beach today or Marina del Rey. And so the city went ahead and built a rock mound breakwater, and in August of 1934, they finished it, and they opened Santa Monica Yacht Harbor, just in time for a regatta that had been on the books for many, many months before. And they opened it successfully and on time. It was a fairly popular little port, popular enough to draw certainly the attention of Charlie Chaplin, who was one of the first to purchase a mooring and a regular visitor to the pier at that time. And Charlie was very popular in the area, very much a part of the community here. He had a beach house about where the Lowe's Hotel is today. And he was very involved with everything during this time in the 1930s. At one time in the 1930s, the Lamonica Ballroom was host to the Santa Monica Lifeguard headquarters. And the Santa Monica Lifeguards opened up an aquarium, and as part of their pitch to open up an aquarium, Charlie Chaplin wrote a letter of support for that. So he was a very vital part of our community at that time, and of the pier in particular. Another yacht owner was Errol Flynn, and his yacht, the Zaka, could be seen out here. Now this yacht harbor and the community that associated with it, the existence of it really spurned a lot of truly wonderful things at the pier. And one of those was wonderful characters. There was a fishing boat captain named Olaf Olsen, who I became particularly fond of when researching for the Pier history book, because his name kept coming up. He retired from the Navy. He was actually an immigrant from Norway, and when he came from Norway, the customs clerk could not spell his last name Krogh. So he said, "Oh, all you Norwegians are named Olsen anyway," and gave him the name Olaf Olsen. And Olsen became a career sailor. He was the bunco mate, who was really the authoritarian on the ship, the security guard almost, if you will. And he had a career at sea. And then when he retired, he moved to Santa Monica and saw the life of Santa Monica Yacht Harbor and the fishing community in particular, because the Yacht Harbor created more opportunities for fishing boats. And so he became a part of that community at the west end of the pier and operated a fleet of fishing boats. He was an early activist. You know, Santa Monica is known for activism today. Well, he was an early one out fighting for the little guy and fighting against commercial net fishing, which would have wiped out fishing in Santa Monica Bay for the individual private fisherman who was just trying to put food on his table. During the Great Depression, he was a local hero. He would take one person a day from the Unemployed Gentlemen's League out for free on one of his boats. He would donate part of his own catch to needy families. He loved to share fishing stories, and with his thick Norwegian accent, children could not really understand a word that he said, but he said it with such delight and laughter that the children were just fascinated with him. And he had a very distinct look. And if you haven't figured it out already, he was a physical model for Popeye, the cartoon character. Now, there are folks in Illinois who would tell you that L.Z. Segar developed Popeye after one of their own. And to a degree, it's certainly arguable that they're right. L.Z. Segar, the cartoonist for the Thimble Theater, created the oil family, olive oil, castor oil, ham gravy. All of his characters were based upon people that he knew back in Illinois. He lived in Santa Monica, though, and had an office on 4th and Broadway. And every day, he and his assistant would walk out to the end of the Santa Monica Pier, rent a skiff, a rowboat, presumably from Olaf Olsen or one of the other fishermen out there, and discuss story ideas. One day, they decided to have the oil family take a boat ride out to Dice Island for some gambling. And when they were trying to figure out who they would who the sea captain would be to take them out to Dice Island, they settled upon the very distinctly recognizable character, the features and the hat and the corncob pipe and the squinty eyes of Olaf Olsen. And Popeye was only actually in the Thimble Theater comic strip for a little over a week, I believe it was, and then they were finished with him. And readers were so adamant that he become part of the series again that they brought him back, and ultimately Segar renamed the Thimble Theater to Popeye, and a legend is born right here in Santa Monica. Undeniable that Olaf Olsen, though, really is the physical model for Popeye. Other enterprises at the end of the pier, of course, the gambling boats, which many of you have heard of. And John, I saw that on your background, the gambling ship Rex. So you could take a water taxi from the end of the pier and enjoy a night out away from the town, I guess you could say, on one of these gambling boats. Opened by the Rex, and a few others were owned by Tony Cornero, who was he was a gangster, and it's really not even debatable as to whether or not the games were fixed. They were certainly fixed, but it was still a night on the town that people could enjoy. And it was 12 minutes by water taxi, being that you they had to anchor their barges out 3 miles away from the shore, to which were considered international waters. The citizens of Santa Monica, and actually a lot of Los Angeles, were not pleased with the presence of these gambling ships and the reputation that they were creating for the area. So there was a long time battle between municipalities and Tony Cornero and other people who ran gambling ships. And it ultimately reached Attorney General, who was then California Governor, Earl Warren. And Earl Warren declared that the 3-mile limit from the beach was incorrect, that it had to be the 3-mile limit from really what was Santa Monica Bay. So from Point Dume to Point Conception, there would be an imaginary line drawn, and then the international waters would start 3 miles beyond that imaginary line, which turned a 12-minute water taxi ride to more like an hour plus water taxi ride, and was inconceivable for the gambling ships. So most of the gambling ships packed up and moved on, except for the Rex, which was Tony Cornero's crown jewel. And he was on the Rex at the time of this closure. And they actually had a standoff with officials who were trying to close the operations. And they would, every time the authorities would try to access and get aboard the Rex, they were rebuffed with water spraying from hoses. And this went on for several days before Tony Cornero finally surrendered, his excuse being that he needed a haircut. And that was effectively the end of the gambling ships. People come to us all the time asking if that could ever be resurrected now. It would be very interesting to see something similar to that. Cannot guarantee that it would happen, but a great part of the Pier's history. Also, I mentioned earlier the Santa Monica Lifeguards. So the Santa Monica Lifeguard Force was really one of the most influential, certainly for its time. It had among the best watermen in the world as part of its crew, and all innovators. So they were not only talented in the water and with rescuing and also swimming and paddleboarding and all the things that a lifeguard, someone who was very good in the water could do, but they were innovative in their designs as well. And they were also very attractive to celebrities. This is Buster Crabb, Olympian and actor Buster Crabb being pinned as an honorary lifeguard. And if you look in the background, the lifeguard headquarters at this time, which is in 1933, was at what we now know today as Rusty's Surf Ranch. It started out there, and then in 1934 moved to the Lamonica Ballroom, which I mentioned before. And then ultimately they moved their headquarters out to the west end of the pier until they joined the Los Angeles Lifeguard Force in the 1960s. And Los Angeles County and their headquarters is next to the pier. So there's always been a great lifeguard presence here at the pier. That man on the right in the hat is the founder of the Santa Monica Lifeguards, Cap Watkins, who was a very good friend of the previously mentioned Earl Warren. They would visit and commiserate quite often. In fact, when Cap Watkins was getting up there in years, he was having a little bit of difficulty passing his physical, as I understand it, but Earl Warren stepped in and made sure that he could still serve as captain of the lifeguards. I mentioned Pete Peterson a minute ago. One of the, probably one of the most influential lifeguards in the world for many reasons. Surfers and lifeguards today still regard Pete Peterson as being the greatest waterman who ever lived. He could do anything in the water. You can see him surfing here in a couple of photos. The lower photo is a paddleboard race. He was a champion paddleboard racer. He was excellent in boats, and after he retired as a lifeguard, he ran a shop at the end of the pier, and he would service boats here in Santa Monica Yacht Harbor up until the day he died. He was a stuntman for movies and an advisor for movies like Jaws. And he was also one of his great boating stories, and I don't get to tell this one often. It's been told to me by a retired lifeguard, and I'm going to tell it as best I can and as succinctly as I can. But he was several miles offshore in his boat when it sprang a leak and actually developed a sizable hole in the back of the boat, and he knew he was going to sink, and there was no way he was going to get his boat back to the pier, let alone to safety. Unless he acted quickly. And without hesitation, he punched a hole in the front of his boat and then ran his boat as fast as he could. So the water passed from the hole in the front through the hole in the back and stayed afloat that way just by his speed and the water rushing through instead of gathering inside. And he made it all the way back to the pier. And to me, that's just a fascinating story, to be able to think that quickly and know the workings of what was going to happen so well that he would be able to save his own life just by doing that. Just amazing. Perhaps the most amazing thing about Pete Peterson, though, was his work out of the water. He was a very skilled craftsman, and he made paddleboards. He made surfboards. Today we had, for many years, we had one of his paddleboards on display down in the shop. It's a very coveted item. You know, people have wanted to purchase that board, and people try to purchase his boards whenever they can find them. A Peterson board is really a prized possession for anyone who has one. But another thing that he created, and this is seen all over the world, and he doesn't get enough recognition for it, is the Peterson Rescue Tube. You may never have heard of it called the Peterson Rescue Tube, but it's that orange foam tube you see at every swimming pool, every lake, and every beachside around the world. That's called a Peterson Rescue Tube, and it was invented and developed by Pete Peterson, this Santa Monica's own lifeguard. The Santa Monica Yacht Harbor sign, which everybody calls it the Santa Monica Pier sign. It does not say Santa Monica Pier anywhere upon it. It says Santa Monica Yacht Harbor. And now you know why. Santa Monica Yacht Harbor was really what this area was known as in the 1930s and 1940s. It was unveiled to the public in June of 1941. And this is the opening day, the day that they unveiled it. They unveiled it because of that bridge that you drive down right after it. That bridge was built in 1939 and 1940 in order to accommodate all of the traffic underpass, the activity that takes place underneath it, and still grants a way to the pier. What it didn't grant was a view of the pier so that people knew what they were driving to. So the pier's business tenants at that time pooled their money together and had this sign designed and erected in 1941 so that people knew where they were going to. They were going to Santa Monica Yacht Harbor for some sport fishing, boating, and cafes. I mentioned earlier Dick Hernage in the flat cap in that early picture with the large giant black sea bass. And if you look down, I don't know if I have a pointer here, but if you can see the man in the fedora and the striped tie, that's about, he's 5 people from the right of your picture. That's Dick Hernage again. He was president of the Santa Monica Pier Businessmen's Association at the time, and he is the one who gathered the money and headed the project to have this sign erected at the top of the pier bridge. It is one of the most recognizable, iconic signs in the world. You immediately know that this is the sign for the Santa Monica Pier, even though it doesn't even say Santa Monica Pier upon it, but it is the symbol of the pier. As much even today probably as the Ferris wheel, although the Ferris wheel is giving it a really good run for its money. In the 1940s, even in spite of the Second World War, the Santa Monica Yacht Harbor was really a very, very popular place to be, and really largely because of a paddleboard club, which doesn't get enough recognition today. People think of paddleboarding today as stand-up paddleboarding, but back in the 1930s and 40s, it was a prone. You laid flat on your board, and there was a lot of racing that took place. And the Santa Monica Lifeguards really made it a very popular sport. Not really intentionally. To them, it was a life-saving tool, but they would have their own races. People would gather on the pier and watch people race, and ultimately the public grabbed a hold of this and ran with it. And the pier area, the beach clubs up alongside north and south of the pier had paddleboard clubs that would hold races. And there was a man named Ed Hawkins, who was a regular at Muscle Beach, just south of the pier. But he had a daughter named Dottie, who when she was about 8, 9 years old, she was coming down to Muscle Beach with him all the time. And they found their way to the north side of the pier and rented a paddleboard, and then went out and paddled together. And after a few days of doing this, he noticed that she was pretty proficient on the paddleboard. And so he entered her into a race. And the race was at Bayona Creek down south from here. And he entered her into the only class that he could, which was a women's class, but it was all adults. Dottie, 9 years old at the time, took third place against adults. Immediately, Ed thinks, well, I've got a prodigy here. This is really special. So he decided that he was going to try and get Dottie into a paddleboard club. But he couldn't afford to join one of the private clubs up and down the beach. So he worked with Cap Watkins, the lifeguard captain, who helped him to find some space on the pier, and he could create his own paddleboard club, a public paddleboard club, if you will, that was open to anyone. All you had to do was have a little bit of change to rent a board for a little while, and you were considered a club member. And so this club was built around Dottie. Dottie continued to race. That's Dottie on the right in this photo, by the way. She never finished a race at less than first place again. She was really that good and that proficient on the board. This club also created two very unique sporting and artistic interpretations of paddleboarding. One was paddleboard water polo. So you could experience, you could watch from the pier, you could watch people playing water polo next to the pier on boards. And you could experience paddleboard water ballet. And what these two women have right here are ballet boards. And Dottie's is a Stars and Stripes design. This is just after the end of the Second World War. Actually, it's 1946, this photo. Dottie's 17 years old in this photo by now. And they would, on these boards, they would perform post-Second World War water shows, traveling water shows, and perform their paddleboard ballet all around Southern California and other parts of the United States. Ultimately, this club performed all around the world, not with Dottie at the time, but they developed this wonderful expression that you can do upon paddleboards. Today, something similar, although not synchronized like the paddleboard ballet, but you see people doing yoga on paddleboards. So that's reminiscent of what they were doing back then. As I mentioned, this was during the Second World War. The Second World War did not have a tremendously negative impact upon Santa Monica Yacht Harbor. In fact, it had a very profound and positive impact towards the pier. And that is in that the U.S. Navy, once the war broke out, the U.S. Navy took over the port of Los Angeles and effectively moved out all of the fishing boats. And fishing boats looking for somewhere to unload their catch were able to come to the Santa Monica Pier and unload their catch and load it onto trucks and have that shipped off to where people needed food. And it became such a tremendous amount of activity that was very hard on the pier. The trucks were so hard on the pier that they caused significant enough damage that in 1941, the pier had to be shut down to all vehicles. And this created a problem in that the fishing boats were still bringing in their catch, but now they did not have any trucks to unload them onto, so the catch was turned away. And fishermen rebelled by throwing their fish into the ocean out of protest because they weren't going to be any good anywhere else. They couldn't drop them off anywhere else. And ultimately the federal government stepped in, helped out the pier, the city of Santa Monica to fortify the pier enough to reopen and accommodate these trucks so that business could continue. So the Second World War, while you see people playing here, this is just after the war, but you saw a lot of the paddleboarding activity during the war. Still it was a very secure feeling around here, and people were still playing in the water and doing lots of positive things in the water between the fishermen and the paddleboard clubs. Quite a lot was going on here at the pier at that time. Another character, and this is a very famous character, who latched on to the popularity of the paddleboard club is Johnny Weissmuller. And here you see him with Dottie Hawkins. That's Dottie on the board. The man on the left is Paul Stater, a Hollywood stuntman and Santa Monica lifeguard. Anita Loest, who was an Olympic swimmer and also had a short career in Hollywood. And Stubby Krieger, a stuntman known more for handling comedic stunts. But this is Johnny pretending to show Dottie what to do to have the best technique on a paddleboard. Ironically, it was she who taught him, and they became very good friends. And he respected her so much that every time he needed to get into shape for one of his Tarzan movies, he would seek out Dottie and say, "Hey, we need to go paddling. I need to get my body in shape for this upcoming movie." Johnny was also an honorary Santa Monica lifeguard, much like Buster Crabb, and a very big part of the presence on the pier in the 1940s. In fact, you could hear him doing his Tarzan yell and swinging on a rope and dropping into the ocean, which must have been a treat for anybody visiting. I often think that the years immediately after the Second World War were probably the best years of the pier up until what we have today. Certainly very popular and many things to do, and people really making the most of an experience on the pier. This is the merry-go-round that those of you who have ridden the merry-go-round in the past 60 years now, 60 some odd years. This is the one that you have ridden. It's been here since 1947. The man on the right is Walter Newcomb. And some of you may know the wide part of the pier as the Newcomb Pier, or still heard it referred to today as the Newcomb Lot, the parking lot. It's certainly something that even the local police still call it as the Newcomb Lot. And that's named, of course, after that gentleman on the right. He bought the lease to the Santa Monica Pier, the wide part of the Santa Monica Pier, the Pleasure Pier, in the 1940s. And in 1940, he also had businesses on the Venice Pier, including this merry-go-round. He moved the merry-go-round to the Santa Monica Pier in 1947 to replace the Parker carousel that had been in the Hippodrome here. And so you're probably wondering, of course, when I say that replace the Parker, what happened to the original Loof carousel? The original Loof carousel was on the Santa Monica Pier from 1916 up until 1939. In 1939, a bank took over the leased area of the pier by default, and they sold the only thing that was really of value, and that was Charles Loof's carousel. And they sold it to Belmont Park in San Diego, where it remained until 1976, until it was sold off for parts. And it was parted out, and those horses are all around the world today. One of those horses appeared on eBay about 10 years ago, I recall, and it was for $20,000. And our organization actually reached out and said, "Hey, how would you like to donate it and send it back to its original home?" And of course, we never heard back. But very coveted horses, those Charles Loof horses. So in 1939, a Parker carousel, which was a competitor of Loof's, was brought onto the Santa Monica Pier. And then in 1947, Walter Newcomb replaced that carousel with his own that he brought from the Venice Pier. This carousel is no slouch itself. It is it's a Philadelphia Toboggan Company, number 62 off of their line, another highly respected carousel company. All of those horses that are on it today are the original 1922 hand-carved horses that have always been on it. Sometimes you will find a rabbit or a goat or a reindeer or other animal on the carousel, and those are simply filling in for horses that are having maintenance performed on them. So the horses are very well taken care of. It's never going to be parted out like the original Loof carousel, and it really is one of the prizes of the pier today. When you're riding this carousel today, you are riding a genuine antique, and we are very, very proud of that. Also in the 1940s, the Spade Cooley Show, or as it was originally known as the Hoffman Hayride. Spade Cooley was at the time considered one of the finest country swing musicians in the world. In fact, he called himself the king of Western swing. And he performed in the Lamonica Ballroom on a regular basis under the name Hoffman Hayride. And Hoffman was a company that sponsored his show. So you could come witness Spade Cooley on the Santa Monica Pier. And at that time, he was one of the most popular musicians in the area. And this is a time when Lawrence Welk, of course, was very popular too. But Spade was right up there. He was the premier act, and he was so popular that in 1948, KTLA came to broadcast his show. Local television station KTLA came into the ballroom to broadcast his show. And it was the first ever live broadcast of a television variety show. And that's the Spade Cooley Show, known as the Hoffman Hayride at that time. Became so popular that Spade was so popular, they ultimately changed the name to the Spade Cooley Show. And he enjoyed quite a successful run for several years before moving into the studio, which was an easier environment for him to work within. Ultimately, they say his ego got a little bit too big, and he and KTLA parted ways. A side note that doesn't have anything to do with the Pier, and some of you may know this about Spade Cooley, so I'm not going to hold it back. He had a rather unfortunate end to his career. He accused his wife of having an affair, and he brutally murdered her and went to jail for that. When he got out of jail on good behavior, he was considerably older, but he played one show and then had a heart attack right after. And that's our own Spade Cooley. But that's probably the way, those circumstances in his career probably are why Lawrence Welk is so popular, so much more popular and recognized today, and nobody's ever heard of Spade Cooley. But at the time, he was one of the big ones. After the 1940s and into the 1950s and 1960s, the Pier was suffering from a lot of neglect and was a drain on the city. The breakwater that the city had built was not holding up against the elements very well, and it would crumble and had to be constantly repaired in order to keep the boating community involved. The pier itself had suffered a lot of damage, as I mentioned, in the 1940s, and it wasn't getting any younger, and it was beginning to fall apart. The city was really tired of putting money into keeping the municipal pier afloat and dealing with the breakwater falling apart, and so they were trying to come up with other ideas. And one idea in the 1960s was to build a causeway that would take people, it would basically replace the coast highway. It would be a series of islands with a highway upon it that would be the new route to Malibu. And the pier was envisioned as could be a part of that, could be replaced by it. Many discussions as to how to make this causeway work, and ultimately it never did. However, that did not mean that it was the end of ideas for what to do with the pier. City manager Perry Scott in the late 1960s, early 1970s was tasked with what do we do to make the pier more viable. The city council tasked him with that. And he came back with the idea that maybe the breakwater could be, you could add more rocks to the breakwater and build a large man-made island with a resort hotel and a convention center, and use the pier as extend the pier and use it as a bridge out to this fantastic new island. And so the council thought, oh, it's a good enough idea. Let's put it to the voters for funding. They put it on the ballot and voters rejected it. And understandably so. It would be a very expensive venture. But that didn't stop Perry Scott. Perry went forward with his idea for the island and took it out to a developer who loved the idea and would pay for the idea and didn't need to approach the voters, just needed approval of the city council. So they came back with a very elaborate plan for this man-made island with a resort hotel and a convention center and other amenities. And their plan was to do away with the Santa Monica Pier and just build a standard bridge that would be far more suitable. Well, the city council reacted to Harry Scott as having done a job very well. He's found something that would be not only more viable, but probably redefine Santa Monica and become a shining jewel for the Santa Monica Bay. So they voted to tear down the pier in favor of building this island. Well, this immediately caught the community's attention. By this time, the piers in Venice and Ocean Park, which those of you who tuned in last week or a couple weeks ago learned all about the Pacific Ocean Park and that pier, they were gone by this time. It was 1972, and the last pier remaining, the last of the great pleasure piers remaining, was the Santa Monica Pier. And while it did not have the amusement park or all of the glitter and glam of those previous piers from the golden age, it was still Santa Monica's pier. And it was something that they'd really grown attached to within their community. Developers did not agree, and developers were always trying to make Santa Monica into something far more special and attractive, and the pier just didn't fit into those plans. So, and the city council was really on that same path. So the city council voted to tear down the pier. The community didn't like it, and the community fought, and it was a long and actually hard fought battle. And if it had not been an election year in which 3 of those city council members were up for re-election, we probably would have lost the Santa Monica Pier. But the community focused their attention toward those 3 city council members running for re-election and ultimately got each one of them to change their vote. Now, there were other factors that went into all of this. There were environmental concerns, and the island was clearly going to cause more problems and create more financial difficulties than probably solving. But at the same time, the Santa Monica Pier, the community proved to the Santa Monica Council that the pier was worth saving and a very vital part of the community. So the city council went ahead and changed their votes and saved the pier. However, they didn't save their jobs. The community, by the next election, actually by that election that those 3 city council members were up for re-election, they failed in their bid. The community selected new city council members. In fact, of all of the city council members who voted to tear down the pier, and there were 6 of them, not a single one ever won re-election. 5 failed in their re-election bids, and 1 passed away in office. And this began kind of a change of the tide in Santa Monica politics. Some people even credit it with the paving the way for Santa Monica renters' rights. I stopped just short of saying that because I wasn't here. But there are people who still cling to that. And it really, you can see people gathered here in City Hall in this photograph. It really was the beginning of the community becoming far more involved. And that, I think we can all agree, is something that Santa Monica is very well known for today. I mentioned Olaf Olsen being an early activist. Everybody was becoming an activist in the 1970s, and the Santa Monica Pier situation was really the catalyst for a lot of people to jump on board and express themselves. So the pier was saved. 2 years later, it was landmarked. And even today, for any significant change or even the now ridiculous notion to tear down the pier, for anything like that to be proposed, it would have to be put in front of the people, not the city council. So voters would decide on the fate of the Santa Monica Pier from now on, from 1975 on, which is really significant. Some people who are major players in this, there were so many. In this photograph right now, I can see a lot of my in-laws. They were very involved with it and very proud to tell you that. There were people that would, of course, the pier tenants. There were a couple of groups that called the pier home. One was a lot of fishermen that also worked with the pier tenants. A woman named Diana Sherman, who the epitaph on her tombstone, she saved the pier, and she's not the only one who has that on their tombstone. The crew at Al's Kitchen, which is about where the patio of the Albright is today. Al's Kitchen was known as a place where artists and activists would hang out. The likes of Tom Hayden, Jane Fonda, Joan Baez, who's in this picture right here. Joan Baez, very involved in helping to save the pier. And Robert Redford, and he and Paul Newman made the sting during this time, and they signed the petition to save the pier. That's Robert carrying the football right there with the cowboy hat on. And lesser known people like Jack Sicking, who was the manager of that Al's Kitchen that I mentioned before. A lot of people say he was the mastermind that behind the Save the Pier movement. And he and Diana Sherman, I think, they didn't know each other well, and they'd probably argue all the way to their graves about whose idea it was to go after the city council. Well, it was somebody's idea, and maybe it was everybody's idea at the same time, but they will both tell you, and people will tell you, that these are the people who saved the pier. Even more so than having the celebrities' names attached, it was the community, and the community saving something that they loved, which is just, it's beautiful and it's fantastic, and everybody who's a part of that movement to this day, when they talk about it, they get a little teary, because it meant that much to them, and they made a difference, and they've made a difference for all of us. And I have so much respect for the group of people that saved the pier. Of course, 10 years later, Mother Nature stepped in and almost did what the city council had voted to do in 1973. It was an El Nino year, and I think enough of you know what an El Nino year means by now. But there was a series of just storm after storm after storm coming and battering the coastline, and many piers were lost during this time. If you've been to Paradise Cove, that was a victim of the El Nino year of 1983. This particular photo is January 27th, 1983, the first of two significantly large storms that rolled in that year. And it was reported to have 10-foot high seas moving in. The lower fishing deck, which was beloved by the community and by fishermen, absolutely beloved by fishermen, where Pete Peterson's shop was. I mentioned earlier that he had a shop out at the end of the pier, where Oatman Rock Shop, which we still have on the pier today and is the last surviving business of the West End, it was located out at this West End. It was only 8 feet above mean high tide. So with the 10-foot seas coming in, everybody knew something had to give. And by everybody, I mean quite a lot of the community, not everybody, but quite a lot of the community knew that something had to give, and lined up atop the Pacific Palisades in Palisades Park here, and braving high winds and sleet to watch what the sea was going to do to the pier. And sure enough, the 10-foot seas destroyed the lower fishing deck. And it's absolutely amazing to see people standing up there with a camera and up there while this destruction is taking place. But sure enough, the lower fishing deck was destroyed. Not the upper part of the pier, thankfully, but that lower fishing deck was completely destroyed. And all those businesses and all the fishing area, all the places where they had boats for rent, all gone. The breakwater also all but destroyed. And city manager at the time was a man named John Alschuler. And he didn't hesitate the next day while they were surveying the damage. He told the press that, the press and the community not to worry because they would rebuild. And sure enough, they began, as soon as the weather allowed, they began the process of rebuilding. And they took a large crane out to the west end of the pier, and with the intent of cleaning up all the damage so that they could prepare for rebuilding. And a few weeks later, March 1st, 1983, another storm of equal size with the 10-foot seas was reported to be coming in, and that crane was still out at the end of the pier. And I have talked with a couple of the pier maintenance crew that were working back then, and they tell me that they warned the contractor that owned that crane that they'd better get it off of the pier, or it was going to be a lot of trouble later on. And unfortunately, they told him late in the afternoon, it was almost quitting time. And while they did move that crane about 50 feet inland, they left as soon as the bell rang. And sure enough, the storm rocked the pier to the point that that crane fell into the ocean and acted as a battering ram and destroyed the entire west end of the pier and about a third of the pier's surface overall. Just a tremendous damage. And Alschuler got together with the press again the next day and reassured everyone, don't worry, we are still going to rebuild the pier. It's just going to take us more time. And it did. What this did, though, was actually turned out to have a silver lining. The pier was saved and landmarked in 1973 and 1975, respectively. But that didn't mean that it suddenly became viable. It was still a headache for the city, and it was still an eyesore. Those of you who know what used to be the Holiday Inn and is a Wyndham up a block away from the pier may notice that none of the windows face the pier. That's because that's what the city and developers thought of the pier at the time. They didn't want anyone to have to look at our eyesore. So there was a committee, a task force, the pier task force, that was developed to try and figure out how to make the pier more viable. And frankly, they were still struggling because they were having to deal with all the existing structures and amenities that were on the pier. And how do you suddenly, make them a more successful venture when, when you're basically stuck with immovable structures? So wiping out a third of the pier's surface with the intent to rebuild turned out to be just what the community needed to reinvent the pier and make it more viable. And this is where the idea of building an amusement park came from, and making the pier family friendly and having fine dining out at the end of the pier instead of a 24-hour cafe, and really changing the way that the pier is going to be used in the future. Not just a fishing pier, not a former yacht harbor, because the breakwater was no longer effective and it wasn't really that much of a yacht harbor by then anyway. Not this seedy place as seen by some, bohemian, if you will, seen by others, but something that would appeal to families and be more approachable for a different audience. That's where all this came about. And so while they're rebuilding the pier right here, and this is a picture from 1989, it looks like, and if you remember, I said I'd been on the pier for 31 years. 1989 was my starting year. And way up on the left side of the photo here is the boathouse, the little brown building. And I may be inside one of those windows right now, tending bar, watching them rebuild this, which was a fascinating thing to watch. And the hope that was coming along with it of the new pier. On April 5th, 1990, they finished rebuilding that pier. And around the same time, we're unveiling plans for the amusement park that opened in 1996, Pacific Park, the amusement park that we have today, opened in 1996, and it was the first time in 66 years that there had been a permanent fixed amusement park on the Santa Monica Pier. You see in this photo, this 1989 photo, a small Ferris wheel over at the very, very eastern part of the pier inland. And there was a little traveling kind of carnival or amusement park that would come here every summer for several years, but never anything full scale and permanent until Pacific Park. Pacific Park opened and began to change everything. The intent of the task force, which became the Pier Restoration Corporation, which is the Pier Corporation that I work for today, the intent of that original group was beginning to see its success. Also seeing success were events. And right here, you can see that amusement park in the background of a bunch of people staring at what must be a stage. And that would be for the Twilight Dance series. When the pier was torn down in 1983 by the storms, a lot of people assumed that the pier was closed. And so visitorship was almost nothing at this time. And so the city began to put on events at the pier in order to announce to people that it is open and to please come visit our pier while we were rebuilding it. And in 1985 was the initial Twilight Dance series. It was not called the Twilight Dance series yet. It was held underneath a tent about where Pacific Park is today, where their event pavilion is today, and free concerts every Thursday night. And the first year was 4 weeks, The second year they expanded to 8 weeks, and that's when they renamed it, or they named it the Twilight Dance Series. And then to 10 weeks the following year, and then bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was, they used to have the stage out where the Ferris wheel is today, facing inland, until 1991, when Bo Diddley played, and played so loud that there were noise complaints on as far away as 20th Street. So then they had to move the stage to the other side. And it's really evolved. And those of you who have seen the series grow and evolve know just how big and popular that it really is. I mentioned earlier a number of 24,000 people. That's a lot of people, considering you can only fit about 6,000 in the parking lot if you're using the entire parking lot. So very, very popular series. But really, between the Twilight Dance Series and Pacific Park, the makeup of the Pier's population and the people who came to appreciate the Pier was changing significantly for the better, and towards something that was actually far more viable. Businesses were successful because of Pacific Park and because of the Twilight Dance Series. And the Twilight Dance Series opened a way for other events. People can come in and rent space for their own events, their own organizations, which exposes the Pier to more people who can come and enjoy the Pier on another time. Events that our office has since imagined and produced are Roga. Those of you who are yoga fanatics and have enjoyed our fitness program, it's Run Plus Yoga. And that's it starts with a 1-hour run that people meet at the top of the Pier bridge underneath the sign and go for a run, and then meet at the end of the Pier for yoga afterward. In the background, you can see paddleboarders, and paddleboarding is still very much a part of the Pier here. We host a paddleboard race every June. It's become probably the best event, the one that's truest to the Pier and represents the Pier in the way that it uniquely ties the Pier and the beach and the ocean together in a way that no other event can. It's really a very special day. So we've continued with the events, and what that does is bring more people who probably ordinarily wouldn't come to the Pier unless for a specific reason, unknown to us at the time. But we really draw these people together to see and experience the Pier and see what the Pier has become, and it just continues to become more popular. When I started at the Pier, there were an estimated 2 million visitors a year, and the bulk of that was summer tourists. And now we're up easily well over 10 million visitors a year, and the Pier is crowded year round. If the sun is out, there are thousands of people on the Pier. And I'm speaking in non-COVID times, but even during COVID, we're getting a good crowd. We're getting people who really are coming and enjoying just the atmosphere of the Pier. And a nice walk on the deck boards and walking out over the ocean is really an experience unlike anything you can get, certainly in Colorado, where I come from, but in other parts of the world. It's just a very pleasant and wonderful experience. And so I go back to the words that I said toward the beginning, and these are my words. The soul of the Pier is founded upon memories, the memories of those who enjoyed it before us and the memories that are still being created today. And I really think that is the mission of our organization, the Santa Monica Pier Corporation. It's certainly been what has attracted and energized myself for the Pier, and has kept me here for the 31 years that I've been here. And it's still my favorite place in the world, and a place that I call home. And it's because of those memories created and the memories that we're still working on today. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We've got one from Jeff Wynn. And Jeff says, do you know why Chaplin did not have a beach home by the Gold Coast like all the other moguls and movie stars? He asked if you to also talk briefly about how long it took to remove the yacht harbor and build out the beach, and where they got all the sand from.
Jeff, I can't answer the Charlie Chaplin question, and it's a good one. I'm sure that somebody can. There are people who are very, very much students of the Gold Coast and probably would know much more about Charlie Chaplin than I would. The Yacht Harbor. The Yacht Harbor was built to solve a big problem, right? And that was to create income for Santa Monicans and Santa Monica in general. And you're right, it was it actually ended up creating some problems, a very significant problem, and that was as the city was building the breakwater and putting these rocks in the ocean to build that big rock mound, they changed the current. And the current began to deposit a lot of sand next to the pier and actually rob sand of the south beaches, such that it was creating I don't have a picture right here available, but you could see that the sand would create a large divot towards the breakwater and a huge buildup of sand. To give you an idea, anyone who can right now visualize where the merry-go-round building is and where the sand is, the waves used to break underneath the merry-go-round building. And the beach was underneath the merry-go-round building there, but that's where people would gather to visit the beach. And the breakwater so significantly altered the current that the sand began pushing out towards the breakwater and effectively shrinking the yacht harbor and removing income opportunities of the yacht harbor by, for the moorings. So it was a near disaster, really, when you think about it. The city now had to pay to dredge. They had to pay someone to dredge the sand out and to replenish the South Beach sand by taking it away from the pier and keeping the mooring space for the yacht harbor. So it created a problem almost as big as what the city had anyway, when you really think about it. But ultimately, the city gave up the fight of dredging the sand and moving it and creating the space for the yacht harbor. And it kind of took a, if you can't beat them, join them approach, and started building groins in the North Beach to encourage the buildup of the sand. And so that's why we have our big broad beaches in Santa Monica today, is the city giving up a fight that they had created and effectively lost, and joining that fight and creating something that ended up being quite beneficial in itself.
All right, Mary Pat Cooney asks us about Lamonica Ballroom. She's wondering if you can tell us what happened to Lamonica Ballroom.
The ballroom had, you would think something that was described as being like a castle floating over the ocean and was billed as the largest ballroom in the world. And something like that, you would think it would be such a prized possession for Santa Monica, or at least for the people who were handling the least part of the pier at that time. But from the beginning, it seemed to have a downhill trajectory. It had that wonderful opening night that caused the first traffic jam recorded in Santa Monica. But just a few years later, a storm damage to the substructure, the pilings underneath it, was so significant that they had to close the ballroom for several months and tear up the dance floor and then rebuild the substructure and then reopen. And by the time they got reopened, it was just before the Great Depression hit. And the Great Depression had that ominous impact of wiping out the amusement park, certainly, and what created opportunities like Santa Monica Yacht Harbor, it didn't do the ballroom any favors. The ballroom in the late in 1929 and 1930 was actually used for what began as walkathons and then became dance marathons. And if you've ever seen the movie They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Or read the book, dance marathons were literally contests where you would dance till you dropped. And the idea being that whoever remained on their feet the longest would win a cash prize. So it was a desperate way to try and gain money, and to the point where it was a health hazard, and people were people were dancing till they dropped and maybe died. And the city council at that time put an end to that because it was a health hazard. So an attempt to keep the dance spirit alive really was a failed attempt. The city ended up leasing the ballroom and using it in beginning in 1933, and began using it as a convention center. And one of the early conventions held there was for female pilots, and Amelia Earhart was one of those pilots. And it was a flight that would take people. The race was from Santa Monica to, I believe, Cleveland, Ohio. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it was Cleveland. Amelia did not win it, but it was used as a convention center. There were car shows inside the ballroom. The city also put in the Santa Monica Lifeguard headquarters, and they opened an aquarium. The city tried apartments there. They tried a roller rink twice. Twice the ballroom was used as a roller rink. When Santa Monica City Hall was moving from its location in downtown Santa Monica to the location it is now, the ballroom, part of the ballroom was used as a temporary jail. There were actually 2 jail breaks while it was a jail. It was a terrible place for a jail. It wasn't built to be a jail. So there were 2 jail breaks during the existence there. And so it had a lot of really interesting and a variety of uses, but nothing to great success. I mentioned apartments. There were apartments in it when Jay Fiandella was working at Sinbad's. He had one of those apartments, and so it was a living space. But ultimately, it was never really cared for as the jewel that you would think it was, certainly by its opening. And by 1962, the walls were starting to cave in, and the roof was buckling, and it was condemned. And the city surrounded it with chain link fence for about a year before finally tearing it down. And it was not replaced with anything. It was parking lot up until storm damage in 1983. And then when it was, even after it was rebuilt for that, it was used for parking lot again for a little while. And then Pacific Park was built in that same footprint. And that's why they have the same footprint, is it's that same space.
So there was a young woman who liked to come to the carousel, and she liked to be incognito. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you might tell us about that.
In the 1960s, a young woman would come with an overcoat on and a scarf over her head and sunglasses over her eyes, and sit on a bench and watch the merry-go-round horses going round and round. And she would spend hours doing this. And one day, the carousel operator, who was kind of a crotchety man who looked a little bit like Popeye himself, he decided he was going to approach her and straighten out her life. And so he walked up to her and he said, young lady, why do you keep coming here? You're young, you should go out and get a job. At which time she removed her sunglasses and removed the veil from her head and anything else covering her face, and basically said, well, silly, I do have a job. I'm Marilyn Monroe. And that actually was told in the Los Angeles Times. It was George Gordon, the owner of the arcade, who operated the merry-go-round at the time that she visited, who would tell that story. And George had some good stories on his own too.
Well, Jim, thank you again so much for this. We really appreciate it. Could not be happier that you did this. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.